So we're going to talk about screening, but I want to start by telling you the difference between screening and assessment, because people mix these terms up, right? They say they use them interchangeably, and they are absolutely not interchangeable. So screening is a very brief way to identify someone who needs further assessment, right? It's quick. I'm going to show you a 20-second screening tool. That is very different than the assessment, which is a more comprehensive evaluation. It confirms risk and it guides next steps. So keep this in mind. If you hear someone interchanging screening and assessment, stop them, because screening and assessment are two different things. So just very briefly, the brief suicide safety assessment ideally is done by a social worker, but many places don't. Most places don't have the luxury of a social worker. So another clinician, a nurse practitioner, a physician assistant. In the Indian Health Service, we train pharmacists to do this next brief suicide safety assessment. Residents, trainees, fellows, those kind of clinicians can be trained. There's two tools people use, either the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale or the ASK Brief Suicide Safety Assessment, which we made so people could do this further triage of the ASK. But really, whatever tool you use, it's helping the clinician decide what are the next steps for this patient. This patient screened positive. Are they imminent risk and they need an emergency visit? Are they low risk and nothing more has to happen at this time? Or the harder category is the yellow. You identified something, it's not an emergency, but they need further evaluation as soon as possible. So we have 6 versions of this. Actually, we have 8 versions because we have a telehealth version now. They're all available on the NIH Ask Toolkit.
So someone asked, is there a difference between the Ask and the Columbia screener?
The Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale was made as a surveillance tool when the FDA had a black box warning put on SSRIs. It was not created as a suicide risk screening tool. It was a surveillance tool. It makes a better assessment than a first-line screener. And that's because the screening part of the Columbia actually was never, if you look, you can't find the screener version that was created through research. The Ask actually, I recommend people who use the Columbia to start with the Ask as the primary screener and then use the Columbia as the assessment. The Ask is very quick. It was created through research. It was tested. It was validated. The Columbia makes a better assessment because that's how it was developed and tested that way.
Does the risk assessment have to be the BSSA or can it be C-SSRS with safety?
No, the Joint Commission says you don't even have to use a tool, but if you're going to use a tool, it has to have certain elements. And 2 of those elements are risk and protective factors. And the Ask BSSA has risk and protective factors and the CSSRS doesn't. And that's why it's often paired with the safety. But no, it doesn't matter what tool you're using. You just have to make sure you do a good assessment. The screening tool, I think, does matter. And I say that as not just the Ask, but the PSS3 is a good tool. Evidence-based screener is really important. These conversations are so hard to have. And I say that I'm trained, to assess someone for suicide. And every single time I go for a suicide risk assessment and I send a patient home rather than to the emergency room, I walk away with like white knuckles and I just pray that I did the right thing, right? That I made the right decision, because it's so hard to know and you never really know. And then if someone in my personal life, if I'm worried about them, this is not an easy conversation to have, even for someone who knows the words. It's always awkward, but it's always important.